The shots you just heard weren't echoes of war, they were echoes of betrayal. Nairobi was supposed to mourn a hero, but the air cracked with bullets instead of prayers. Flags fell. Children screamed, and someone whispered, "They killed him twice." Behind the smoke, a question began to haunt an entire continent: if Raila Odinga's death could still shake the ground. What else have they buried beneath Africa's silence? It happened on October 16, 2025. The body of former Prime Minister Raila Odinga had just arrived from India. The stadium in Nairobi, meant to hold 60,000, overflowed with twice that number. When police tried to block the crowd, panic ignited. Tear gas. Bullets. A stampede. At least 4 people died before the night fell silent again. But witnesses said the people were peaceful, until the uniforms came. One activist whispered, this wasn't chaos. It was a message. And that message would soon cross borders, from Kenya to the heart of Africa's new awakening. They said Africa had moved on, that the days of uprisings and martyrs were gone. But that lie died in Nairobi. The funeral of Raila Odinga became something no government expected, a mirror. A mirror so clear that every Kenyan saw what had been stolen from them: hope, justice, and the right to speak without fear. For years, fear had been the invisible government. It didn't wear a uniform. It wore silence. It walked through offices, classrooms, and streets whispering, "Don't ask too much. Don't dream too far." But on that October morning, when bullets cracked over the heads of mourners, fear finally met its end. Because the people didn't run to hide. They ran to question. From the ashes of that stadium, something was born, an energy that even the state couldn't contain. In every neighborhood of Nairobi, young men painted the walls with a single word: sovereignty. They had heard that word before, from the deserts of the Sahel, from the voices of Traoré in Burkina Faso, Goïta in Mali, and Tiani in Niger. For the first time, East Africa felt the heartbeat of the AES Alliance, not as an idea, but as a pulse under their own skin. The media tried to label it chaos. Foreign commentators called it a tragic breakdown of order. But anyone who stood there that day knew better. It wasn't chaos, it was clarity. When the smoke cleared, people didn't see enemies. They saw themselves. A generation born into debt, trained to obey, now standing up to say, "We have nothing left to lose except our silence." In the middle of the stadium, an old woman picked up a torn Kenyan flag. She pressed it to her chest and whispered, "He fought so we could speak. Now it's our turn." Her words spread faster than any official statement. By nightfall, her voice had reached Kisumu, Eldoret, even beyond the borders into Uganda and Tanzania. Across Africa, youth began asking, if they can silence Kenya, who can speak for the rest of us? And that was the question the elites feared most. Because every government built on borrowed money and borrowed power knows, once people stop fearing, they stop obeying. Kenya was never meant to rebel. It was the model student. The poster child for stability and Western partnership. But the death of Raila Odinga ripped open a truth long buried: stability without justice is only another form of prison. Across social media, images of the funeral spread like wildfire. Some showed people carrying candles. Others showed blood on the streets. But the most powerful image was not the violence, it was a young man standing on a police barricade, holding Raila's portrait high above his head. No anger. No weapons. Just defiance. He became the face of a generation that had outgrown fear. Foreign news outlets were quick to downplay it. An unfortunate incident, they called it. Yet behind closed doors, intelligence reports were flying. Because the words shouted in Nairobi that day were the same ones whispered in Bamako, Ouagadougou, and Niamey, Africa belongs to us. When governments fall, they don't fall because of riots. They fall because of rhythm, because people start walking to the same heartbeat. And on that day, the heartbeat of Kenya joined the drumline of the Sahel. At the University of Nairobi, students began holding night vigils, not just for Raila, but for every voice that had been silenced in the name of democracy. They spoke of a future where Kenya could reclaim its land, its resources, its narrative. They called it the long return. One of them said, if AES could rise from sanctions, then Kenya can rise from sorrow. The regime heard them. And they were afraid. By the following week, new laws appeared, restrictions on assembly, new curfews, digital surveillance. But it was too late. Once people taste freedom, control loses its flavor. And that is the moment when true power shifts, not in parliaments or press releases, but in the quiet decision of millions who say no more. Across Africa. From Dakar to Dar es Salaam, analysts began to notice a pattern. Every uprising, every movement, started the same way, not with leaders, but with funerals. Thomas Sankara. Lumumba. Gaddafi. Now, Raila Odinga. The old guard tried to bury their memory, but every grave became a seed. Kenya's tragedy became Africa's mirror. It showed that colonial systems don't die when the colonizers leave. They survive in the minds of those who inherit their thrones. But a new consciousness was spreading, a rejection of the idea that freedom must be permitted by those who fear it. That night, as Nairobi slowly returned to calm, someone projected a single line of text on a downtown building. From sorrow comes sovereignty. It wasn't graffiti. It was prophecy. If you think this story is too heavy, too political, or too dangerous to discuss, then you already know how control survives. Don't stay silent. Say something in the comments. Because silence is how they win. They said the chaos was over. But the city of Nairobi still breathed like a wounded animal, gasping, trembling, half awake. At dawn, the stadium gates stood open like broken ribs. The echoes of gunfire still floating above the empty bleachers. Official statements rolled out before sunrise, law and order have been restored. But for those who had stood in the rain, choking on tear gas, nothing felt restored. Not order. Not trust. Not the idea of Kenya itself. In the early hours, state media replayed clips of calm streets, edited smiles, polished voices speaking of national unity. Yet the footage that the world didn't see, the screams, the stampede, the bodies carried on motorbikes, flooded social networks faster than the censors could delete. Within minutes. Hashtags like #Justice for Mourners and #Who Ordered the Shots were trending. The internet had become the new courtroom. By noon, embassies released statements urging restraint. The African Union called for dialogue. But on the ground, no one wanted dialogue anymore. They wanted truth, raw, unfiltered, and dangerous. Among the crowds that had fled the stadium was a young man named Brian, a 26-year-old teacher from Kibra. He returned home with blood on his shoes and a phone full of videos. That night, he posted one clip that changed everything. The footage showed uniformed men firing into the air, then lowering their guns. His caption read, "They weren't dispersing us. They were punishing us." The post reached 5 million views before morning. By then, Brian had disappeared. Rumors spread that he had been detained. Others said he had fled. But his face, frozen in a single frame of that video, became the new icon of defiance. For decades, Kenya had prided itself as the anchor of East African democracy, a land of elections, stability, and peacekeeping missions. But that narrative was collapsing in real time. Foreign correspondents arrived, their headlines heavy with irony. Kenya's day of mourning turns deadly. The price of peace in Africa's most stable nation. In cafes, whispers turned to questions. Who ordered the live rounds? Who decided to shoot into a crowd that came to say goodbye to a man who once dreamed of justice? And above all, why did it feel like the same invisible script, written somewhere far from Nairobi, kept replaying again and again across Africa? In Mali. In Burkina Faso. In Niger. And now, here. Because what happened at that stadium wasn't just police brutality, it was a symptom of a system, designed to control what Africans should feel, when they should mourn. And how they should rise. Every bullet fired at the mourners carried a message, don't ask questions. But every life lost that day wrote a louder one, we will. Across the city. Murals of Raila appeared overnight, his face painted in red and gold, eyes looking past the skyline. Street artists called it the Second Awakening. Because when an old man dies, a generation wakes up. University students held silent vigils that turned into marches. The police tried to disperse them. This time, the students filmed everything. They wore placards that read, "You can shoot our bodies, but not our memories." And those words began to spread like wildfire, on walls, buses, and banners. What began as grief was turning into a doctrine. In diplomatic circles, Western advisors called it the Odinga effect, a mix of nationalism, grief, and rebellion. But what they didn't understand was that this wasn't rebellion, it was revelation. For the first time, Kenyans were seeing clearly the architecture of control that had been built over them, loans, elections, partnerships, all designed to look like freedom. If you're still watching this and you feel that chill in your chest, pause for a second. Ask yourself, who benefits when Africa is told to wait for democracy, again and again? If you believe that sovereignty begins when fear ends, leave your thought below. Because your comment isn't just engagement, it's a line in history. By now, even the international press had begun to shift tone. They interviewed grieving families, blurred faces, quiet voices saying the same words, it wasn't chaos. It was a message. The question was, whose message? Behind closed doors. Intelligence briefings circulated among foreign embassies. They warned that the unrest might spread, not because of violence, but because of ideas. Ideas that Kenya's youth were no longer afraid. Ideas that grief could unite faster than politics. Ideas that sovereignty, once spoken, can never be forgotten. And while the elites counted losses, the poor counted names. Brian. Aking. The unknown boy in the red shirt. Every face became a symbol. Every wound became a word. Every silence became a song. By the week's end, the funeral had become a front line, not between citizens and police, but between illusion and awakening. Because once a nation starts asking, who controls our pain, there's no turning back. Freedom, in East Africa, is no longer a slogan. It is a gray zone, where every choice carries a price. In those trembling days across Kenya, the gunfire before Raila Odinga's funeral didn't just shatter the air. It tore through the thin veil separating two worlds, one built on democracy written in the language of aid, the other a rising dream of sovereignty, monitored at every heartbeat. In the quiet corridors of the African Union, the name AES is no longer whispered with suspicion, but with unease. Because when Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger walked out of ECOWAS, they didn't just abandon an institution. They walked away from obedience itself. And that night, as Nairobi's skyline flickered under the glow of morning candles, a group of students in Kisumu raised the AES flag on a wooden pole. They called it the Bondo Flame. That flame spread like a question, does East Africa have the courage to rewrite its destiny? Freedom, when stripped of discipline, becomes chaos. And power, without morality, becomes a new kind of chain. In Tanzania, analysts now speak of the AES turn, a shift toward self-reliant defense models free from NATO or French command. But they forget, East Africa too is searching for its own blueprint of sovereignty. From Dar es Salaam to Kampala, conversations over coffee echo the same theme, what kind of freedom do we want? A middle-aged man answers quietly. We have flags, anthems, constitutions. Yet why must we still ask permission to mine our own ground? That question cuts through the silence like a blade. For nearly 40 years, this region has lived between illusions, between imported democracy and borrowed stability. And now, in the wake of Raila's death, the illusion is crumbling. The streets whisper his name, not as a politician, but as a symbol of the dream deferred, the dream of a Kenya that belongs to Kenyans. The camera moves slowly across faces, vendors, teachers, soldiers, all watching the smoke rise over Nairobi. They are not mourning one man. They are mourning an era, an entire generation that mistook foreign applause for progress. But history is shifting. The AES Alliance, once mocked as a desperate experiment of the Sahel, has become a mirror reflecting Africa's unspoken wish, to stand, even if alone. And that mirror now stares directly at Nairobi. A voice from the crowd breaks through the sound of chanting. We don't want aid. We want dignity. Those words travel like thunder, reaching the ears of a continent that has forgotten how to listen. For decades, the narrative was simple: security comes from the West. Development comes from donors. Order comes from fear. But AES, with Traoré, Goita, and Tiani, is rewriting that story in blood, courage, and dust. Meanwhile, in the heart of Kenya, something deeper brews, a moral crisis disguised as politics. The government speaks of restoring order, yet every bullet fired at a mourner writes a darker truth on the nation's conscience. Because when the people you claim to protect are the ones you fear the most, that's when the mask of democracy starts to melt. And so, the question returns: what is freedom, really? Is it the right to vote every 5 years? Or the right to live without asking permission from history? That night, as candles burned out one by one at Uhuru Park, an old woman whispered to her grandson, "Raila's body is gone. But his struggle is not buried." He nodded, eyes reflecting the flames, and murmured, "Then maybe that struggle must change its flag." The narration slows, voice softer, resonant. Somewhere beyond the chaos, a new chapter is being written, not in parliaments, but in the hearts of young Africans. They are watching AES. Not as outsiders, but as believers, convinced that sovereignty is not an experiment. It is a necessity. And as dawn breaks over the Rift Valley, the echoes of Mali's defiance, Burkina Faso's resilience, and Niger's sacrifice reach the savannas of East Africa. The map of the continent, once drawn by outsiders, is trembling, redrawn by its own sons. If you can feel that tremor, if you believe that Africa's future must be decided by Africans, not by fear, not by favor, then let your voice join ours. Like, comment, and share this message, not for the algorithm, but for the awakening. Because when stories unite, nations remember who they are. And perhaps that's the beginning of real freedom. They thought it was a funeral. But it was never just that. As the crowd in Nairobi wept, somewhere beneath the noise, in the war rooms of power, men in tailored suits were already redrawing maps. For months before Raila's death, encrypted cables between Nairobi, Washington, and Brussels had spoken of containment strategies. Kenya, they said, must not fall under the ideological influence of AES. That phrase, ideological influence, said more than it was meant to. It meant fear. Because AES had done something unthinkable, it made sovereignty contagious. When Traoré rejected the French military bases, when Goita nationalized Mali's gold, when Tiani told the world that Niger would no longer sell uranium for pennies, something shifted in the collective imagination of Africa. And now, in the shadow of Raila's coffin, that imagination had reached East Africa. Inside a dim-lit conference room at Gigerai, a Western diplomat whispered to a Kenyan official, "You must hold the line. If Nairobi falls, Addis and Dar will follow." But the official didn't answer. He was watching a live stream, of thousands of young Kenyans waving not the national flag, but a new one, black, green, and gold, the colors of AES. It was not rebellion. It was resonance. And that terrified them more than any revolution. Documents later leaked by an East African intelligence officer revealed a meeting codenamed Operation Silent Delta, a coordinated plan to counter Sahel-style populism. The instructions were chillingly simple. Control the narrative. Discredit the symbols. Contain the contagion. But how do you contain an idea? How do you quarantine hope? The more the state tried to suppress the gatherings, the louder they grew. Each bullet fired into the crowd did not silence the movement, it baptized it. And by the time Raila's body reached Bondo, what had begun as mourning had become awakening. That week, Kenyan students painted murals of Traore beside Odinga, writing in bold Swahili, Uhuru si zawadi, ni deni, freedom is not a gift, it is a debt. Meanwhile, Tanzanian journalists began reporting quiet meetings between civil society leaders and representatives from Ouagadougou, discussions about partnerships in resource sovereignty. The West called it infiltration. AES called it solidarity. And somewhere in Bamako, Colonel Goita looked at the reports and simply said, "They are beginning to understand." The camera pans across Africa's map, Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, glowing in desert hues, and then East Africa, flickering with new light. A continent once divided by colonial geometry was rediscovering its own pulse. The twist, then, was never about Raila's death. It was about what it ignited. In a single week, the old order realized that control is not the same as stability, and silence is not the same as peace. Because beneath the chaos, something irreversible had begun. The spirit of sovereignty had crossed the equator. So when you see the footage, the tear gas, the flags, the chanting, know this: history wasn't collapsing. It was mutating. The AES idea was no longer confined to the Sahel. It was becoming continental. And that, not the bullets, not the funerals, is what truly frightened the world. Now, as the long night of the old century fades away, Africa is no longer a land of wounds, but of light. That light does not rise from skyscrapers or lavish summits, but from the calloused hands of her people, those who have finally understood that freedom is never granted. It is reclaimed, generation by generation. From Ouagadougou to Bamako, from Niamey to Nairobi, a new generation is rising, not to glorify the past, but to rewrite the future. They understand that the flame of AES is not just a military symbol, but a vow, that no one but Africans will decide Africa's destiny. And if tomorrow the winds turn harsh, if the old empires return to smother that flame, then every African heart will become a spark, together, a sea of fire. Fire keep the flame alive. Because when Africa burns with her own light, the world will finally see, not a continent waiting to be saved, but a continent that has already saved itself.